Hey everybody, it's Mr. Drake. I'm back for part two of this series on World War II on the home front. This video will go into how the war impacted various ethnic groups within the United States and also kind of wrap things up and give a final analysis of how the country was impacted by World War II. First group we'll look at are Latino immigrants, or primarily Mexican immigrants. Large numbers of Mexican males were brought into the United States to replace farm workers that had left the country to go serve in World War II. This was called the Bracero Program. It was an agreement between Mexico and the United States in 1942 for farm workers to come into the United States to harvest crops during the war, primarily in the Southwest, mostly California. This program actually existed until 1964, and a large number of those Mexican immigrants actually end up staying in the country even past 1964, although some did return to Mexico. The influx of Latinos into the United States does lead to outbreaks of racial violence in some places, especially in California. Most notably, the Zoot Suit riots, which happened over a period of 1 week or so in 1943, where American servicemen who were on leave or on base in California began attacking Mexican teenagers and young people in the streets of Los Angeles, mostly because they were wearing what were called zoot suits, which were kind of baggy, you know, garish looking suits that were sort of fashionable at the time, especially among young African Americans and young Latinos. And one of the reasons they angered the American servicemen so much, and other people too, is because fabric was being rationed at the time because a war was on and that fabric was needed for uniforms and stuff, right? And so wearing these zoot suits was seen as like unpatriotic and sort of flaunting the ration program that was going on. And so yeah, there was a good bit of violence against you know, Mexican youth that was considered racially motivated. And it really only stopped when it was pointed out to these soldiers that footage of the Zoot Suit riots was being used in Germany and Japan as anti-American propaganda. African Americans during the war. African Americans would make constant reference during World War II to the Double V campaign. The idea they were pushing for two victories: victory over fascism abroad in Germany and Japan, and also victory over oppression and discrimination within the United States. And they saw their service in World War II as a vehicle toward gaining more respect within the United States. One big civil rights event that happens during the war in the early days is the executive order, which was signed in 1941 by Franklin Roosevelt, which banned discrimination in defense industry. What that means is it does not mean the Army was integrated. That doesn't happen until 1948, after World War II. What this executive order meant was that if your company had a defense contract and was making goods for the military, like making war material, you could not discriminate in your hiring practices, right? You had to have an integrated workforce if you were making things for the war effort. And that was pushed for by a guy named A. Philip Randolph, who was a labor union leader in a big African-American union at the time called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was also later on involved in the Civil Rights Movement. He was one of the organizers of the March on Washington in 1963, along with Martin Luther King. There was a big civil rights group founded in 1942 called CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, founded by James Farmer. They were also involved in the Civil Rights Movement in the years after World War II. African Americans were allowed to serve in the military, but the units were segregated, and in some cases, they were allowed to serve in combat roles. For an example, the picture there, the Tuskegee Airmen, who flew a lot of missions over Europe during World War II. But most black soldiers did things like mess duty, right? Working in the kitchens on the ships or laundry and things like that. The picture of the guy on top there, his name is Doris Miller. He was stationed aboard the USS West Virginia, which was attacked during Pearl Harbor. And when the attack happened, he was on duty, I think, in the mess hall. And when the bombing started, he ran up on deck to go to his battle station. He saw an anti-aircraft gun on the deck where the person manning it had been already killed. And despite having fairly rudimentary training on that particular gun, Doris Miller grabbed the anti-aircraft gun and actually managed to shoot down several Japanese planes during the initial raid there on December 7th, 1941. So he became a hero to a lot of black Americans during the war. His picture was used on recruitment posters in African American neighborhoods. Sadly, he was killed a couple years later in action during World War II. Just a couple of years ago, the U.S. Navy named a ship after him, the USS Doris Miller. He was also portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr. in the movie Pearl Harbor, which is not a very good movie about World War II, but that portrayal was pretty cool. Japanese Americans face a pretty bleak situation during World War II. About 120,000 Japanese Americans along the West Coast were interned, which essentially meant put in concentration camps beginning in 1942 and lasting for a large chunk of the war. That was done as a result of an executive order 9066, which was signed by FDR in the early part of 1942, which allowed the military to establish what were called exclusion zones, where they could take anyone who they deemed to be a domestic threat, essentially any group, and intern them. So not only Japanese Americans were the lion's share of who was interned, although there were some German and Italian Americans who were put into camps as well. This is a result of the just hysteria that happens after Pearl Harbor, where there was a fear, which for a time was probably legitimate, that the Japanese could attack the West Coast of the United States. And this, belief, wrong, that these Japanese Americans, most of whom are actually American citizens, a lot of them were born in the United States, would turn on their country and side with the Japanese in the case of an attack. No evidence for that. Never heard of any Japanese American from the time who said they would have done that or expressed any real anti-American sentiment in that regard. But this internment happened anyway. Quick sidebar. As a result of this fear that the Japanese were going to attack the West Coast, all gatherings of more than, I think, 20,000 people were banned along the West Coast for a time after Pearl Harbor, which included large sporting events. And so the 1942 Rose Bowl, which was supposed to be played New Year's Day 1942 in Pasadena, California, or outside Los Angeles, was actually moved to Durham, North Carolina, where Oregon State and Duke played at what is now called Wallace Wade Stadium on the campus of Duke University. It was the only time the Rose Bowl was held outside California until just last year when, because of COVID-19, it was moved to Texas. Anyway, back on track. Japanese American internment was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1944 in the case Korematsu versus United States. Eventually, internment was sort of phased out as it became apparent the Japanese no longer had the capability to attack the West Coast. Some Japanese American men served in the military during World War II as a way to get out of the internment camps. They were not, however, allowed to fight in the Pacific Theater. They fought in Europe, mostly in the invasion of Italy in 1943. Later on, the U.S. government would acknowledge that Japanese American internment was wrong and issued an apology in the late 1980s and did pay reparations to the survivors of Japanese internment, several $1,000s for each person who had actually been in the camps during the war. Native Americans leave the reservations in pretty large numbers to go work in factories in cities during the war. So you begin to see the population of Native American reservations drop a bit as they seek employment elsewhere. As far as the military goes, some Native Americans just served in infantry during the war, but the most legendary well-known role for Native Americans during World War II was serving as code talkers. Somewhere in Europe, but mostly in the Pacific. Most famously, Navajo Indians would serve as radio operators during the war and in combat because the Japanese did not know the Navajo language and couldn't decode it. So this made it a very effective way for American military units to communicate with each other. There is a movie about that called Wind Talkers that came out a while back. Nicolas Cage was in it as one of the lead roles. If you're interested, it's worth checking out. Pop culture is almost entirely focused on the war during this time, whether it was movies or music, even like, cartoons like Bugs Bunny and stuff like that are very focused on the war. If they were made during this time, like you'll hear, jokes made about, is this car trip really necessary? Referencing the rationing of gasoline, for instance, or, they're very patriotic in tone, right? So that was seen as a way to get people to support the war effort and just sort of, just keep the war kind of in the forefront of people's minds in movies and on radio shows and music and all of that. Lots of propaganda put out by the government during the war. A lot of it kind of racist in nature. Some examples here, some very outdated caricatures of the Japanese that we, of course, would see as today as offensive or commonplace at the time. Some propaganda was used to essentially shame people into complying with rationing or being careful during the war. My favorite one, I think, is on the left there. The "when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler." Encourage people to carpool and save their money or save their gasoline, right? And then on the right, the implication that because you blabbed and like some spy overheard you on a train, someone's kid got killed and that poor dog's never going to see its owner again. Is that likely to have actually happened? Yeah, probably not. But that's kind of where you hear that whole loose lips sink ships thing. Final analysis of the war. The U.S. doesn't suffer compared to European countries. The war wasn't fought here, so America did not have to rebuild a lot of infrastructure after the war, other than maybe in the Philippines and in Hawaii, of course, where the initial attack occurred. The gross national product, the sum of all goods produced by the country, doubles. From 1940 to 1945, government intervention goes through the roof. The New Deal starts that, the idea of the limited welfare state with Social Security and job creation and stuff, right? Through like the CCC and the TVA. But World War II takes that to the nth degree with, the rationing, opening the daycares for women to put their kids in while they worked in factories, unemployment insurance, things like that. All of that comes out of World War II and continues this trend of America's government taking a more active role in the welfare or daily lives of the citizens. And finally, the war was very, very, very expensive. This is one of the most mind-blowing statistics I've ever heard. The government spent $340 billion between 1941 and 1945. Adjusted for inflation, it's about $4 trillion today. Now, so in 5 years, they spent $340 billion, right? The U.S. government from 1776 to 1939 spent $170 billion total. So in 5 years during the war, the government spent double what it had spent in the previous 165 years. Just to show what a complete effort, a complete nationwide mobilization World War II was. The country has not seen anything close to that since. Not even the COVID-19 response would rise to that level. That will do it for our talk on the home front. If you have any more questions, please post them in the comments or let me know. Thanks for listening. Cheers.